Welcome back to part 2 of Murder with Friends. Today on the show, we're talking about fathers who kill. In part 1, we talked about Marvin Gaye Sr. and where you're picking up with us, we're gonna be talking about John List. Now, just to tease a little bit of this case, it's one of the first cases that I remember as a kid being really fascinated with. I think it probably spurred my interest in true crime and unsolved murders. And to help me break down this case for you all today, I have Brooke Thomas. Brooke, had you heard of the case of John List before?
I had not. And you know, we're so on the far end of the spectrum. This is what sparked your interest in true crime. I think the Menendez brothers.
Interesting. We haven't actually covered that on the show yet, so.
It's a fascinating story.
Maybe for another episode.
Maybe I'll be back, I know. But no, I had not heard of this. I'm so glad that, I mean, it's a terrible story, but it's fascinating. It's fascinatingly awful.
Yeah, and it will introduce a theme that we're gonna be getting into in part 3, which is familicide, which is with regards to fathers who kill their families and the motives and psychology behind that. But first, we gotta introduce the case we're talking about. This is John List.
Imagine randomly turning on the television and seeing a forensic artist create a sculpture of a murderer that looks a lot like your neighbor. It wouldn't be someone you know, right? It must be a coincidence. In 1989, a neighbor watched in horror as America's Most Wanted revealed a composite of a man who committed familicide 18 years prior. The sculpture looked exactly like Bob Clark, a quiet elderly accountant who was well known within his community. Nothing indicated that sweet Bob was running from his past and the law. How an attentive viewer broke a cold case wide open and the mass murderer hiding in plain sight. The story of John List, today on Murder with Friends.
So our story begins November 9th, 1971. This is the day where John List has meticulously planned how he will kill his family. And we know, unfortunately, all the gruesome details behind this because he left a lengthy confession letter behind outlining his motives and outlining the method for which he was committing this murder. He would go on to kill Alma, Helen, Patricia, John Jr., and Fred. So those are his 3 children, his mother, and his wife. And he would shoot them at point blank range.
One by one. The fact that he waited for the children to come home to kill them, just living, normal life. Because he shot his wife first while she was drinking coffee. Then went upstairs and killed his mother. And then had lunch, waited until the first 2 kids came home from school.
He cleaned up a bit. They found a mop in the bathtub, so he cleaned up the house a little bit.
So they walk in the house from a normal day at school having no idea their mom is dead, their grandma's dead, in that house, and that this is about to happen to them too. And then the last kid, did he have baseball practice or softball practice or something like that?
Yeah, he comes home later.
And he picked him up and took him to get something to eat or something like that, and then he comes home and it's his turn now too. The story is crazy how he got away with this.
Well, he had a month-long head start, and it all goes back to how he was able to plan this murder, and it makes you wonder just like how long he must have been stewing in the twists of his own mind, figuring out how he was gonna pull this off and how he was gonna get away with it is just so creepy to me.
And you'll never really know why. There's a letter, there's, psychologist interviews.
Yeah, and he's spoken out. He spoke out in 2002, and I know that his defense team, upon appeal, has asserted that he had post-traumatic stress from his time in the Korean War, and there are different things that came into play. And he's also said that he wasn't in a great mental place when this went down, like, for sure. No one is saying that you weren't. Like, you were, like, that's awful what you did.
No one kills people.
Yeah, like, you don't, we knew, bro, we knew, we got it. I think that what he writes in his letter, though, his confession, tells us everything we need to know, that he was dissatisfied with the way that his family was going, and he wanted a fresh start. And then a lot of times in familicide, you'll see that the perpetrator, the case that we're talking about today, our fathers will kill themselves following. So it's a homicide and then it's a suicide, and it's sad all around. When he was asked in 2002 why he didn't commit suicide, he said, because if I commit suicide, I won't go to heaven like my family, and I wanted to be with my family, which is like so messed up.
That's why I say, like, I just feel like I can never trust when someone does something just so out of this world like what he did, because the letter there were so many pieces that just didn't make any sense. You weren't happy with life, you wanted a fresh start, so why didn't you just leave? Why did they have to to die? Why did your babies have to die?
Yeah, and
just leave. People do this every day, unfortunately. Why didn't you just leave?
Right, like why didn't you just be a deadbeat dad?
Yeah.
Like you don't actually have to.
It can't get any more deadbeat than killing your children.
Yeah, for sure. But he felt, I mean, it's these weird feelings of inadequacy where he, his financially he wasn't doing great. He was, he taught Sunday school. He was a devout Lutheran, so he had some church community, but a lot of people said that he was socially weird and he didn't have like a tight, really friend group. And then this is 1971. So this is an interesting time in American history where a lot of people, you see like what was going on in like the 1950s and this kind of puritanical era in American history, and then the 1960s happened and people were like, oh my God, it's all going to shit sort of thing. Right. And I sort of wonder if that played into as his kids were getting older, because while we can say these were his babies, like these were children that were at the age of like going to school and attending school and growing up. And I know that he was particularly nervous about his daughter growing up, and that's someone that he called out in the letter, which is like really gross. There's another element to this story that I just remember the first time I heard about this case when I was like 12 or something that just creeped me out, which was that he planned enough in advance that he had told the neighbors that there was a death in the family and that the family had to go for a funeral. They were going to be away for a while.
So no one would question.
So no one would question why there would be no activity at the house. And then a month goes by and they don't hear from the List family, which is
the drama
strange.
teacher, right? The little girl's drama teacher.
And the neighbors as well.
The neighbors were, because someone said they saw the lights go out in rooms in the house one by one.
I just got chills.
So what does that mean? Were the bulbs running out, or what does that mean?
Yeah, like he'd kept the lights on. So they do what I could assume to be like a welfare check, where someone go checks in on the family, and they find the bodies of the List family are all spread out on a sleeping bag in the living room. And then the detail that's always stuck with me that messed me up was that there was classical music playing, that he had set the radio station to like this eerily calm classical music. And that's where you get into the warped corners of John List's mind, which is that he was trying for them to be at peace. You know what I mean? Like he lays them out on this sleeping bag. They're all side by side. And in his brain, he's like, well, they're together now. They're in heaven now. I saved them from this life of sin and inadequacy that I was feeling, that I was afraid for them. I wouldn't want them to have this life anymore. They're better off. And now they have this music as they ascend into heaven. Like, it's so messed up.
It's so messed up. The only explanation that makes any sense to me is he killed them because he's evil. It's the only explanation that makes any sense to me, because this was before social media. This was before advanced communication. If you left New Jersey, is this where that happened? Do I have the state wrong?
I would have to double check. We're gonna have a pop-up right now on the state. I love our editors.
But it moved to Denver or wherever, or Colorado. It was two states.
Yeah. So he went to Denver.
But he could have just left, changed his name, and the same thing would have happened, except America's Most Wanted wouldn't have been after him, and he could have lived a new life and not even worried about these people.
Yeah, that's so true.
No one would have ever found him.
He assumes this alias after the murders. He has, again, a month-long head start. So while authorities know with absolute certainty that John List is the culprit and they can spread out his image everywhere, he has a month head start where no one even knew that his family was either missing or murdered. So he was able to move about very freely. And he assumes the identity of Bob Clark. He applies for a new social security number and he just starts over. And I mean, he's still the same like kind of socially awkward, shitty guy, but he was able to get his job as an accountant again. He lives pretty normally. His neighbors say that he kept to himself, but there were no indications that there were any feelings of guilt or resentment, or I would even say evil, Brooke. Like no one said there's something weird about this guy. And I've had neighbors that I'm like, you're a little, or your moral compass is kind of weird, And
he was able to get married again.
He was able to get married again. And he
wanted to get married again.
He wanted to start a new life. It's what he wanted. So why? I mean, it's like, how could you be surprised? He said that he wanted to sort of start over and start fresh and redo, which you don't get. You don't get a redo on life. Like
you don't have to end lives to get a redo on life. And it's like, that's the part that just will never make sense to me. He wanted to rid them of this horrible world, but then he wanted to start a new relationship with another woman that he would love, and then maybe eventually want to rid her of this horrible world.
Yeah, and I mean, and she was none the wiser, which is pretty scary.
And what's scary about that is she was in danger. this entire time that they were married, and she had no idea.
Yeah, like she was with
everyone around them
a mass
in
murderer
danger.
who had gotten away with it. To their credit, law enforcement did whatever they could to keep the case relevant and to keep it in the public mind. So you'd see on like the 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary, 15-year anniversary of the murder, they would have these artist renderings of what John List might look like. And the thing with that, which was I guess sort of lacking, is that if you add a couple wrinkles to someone, it doesn't necessarily give a whole image of what someone's gonna look like. I don't know if you guys have seen those sort of generators on the internet, you know, where you can see what you're gonna look like when you're 60 or 70, and they don't really look like you. They just add a couple wrinkles, maybe make your hair white. So on the, I believe it was 18th or 17th anniversary of the John List murders, there was this new show on the air called America's Most Wanted. It hadn't been on the air for even a year when this went down. And they reached out, the law enforcement on the John List case reached out, said, maybe you guys can help us with something. They used a forensic sculptor and a forensic psychologist to work together in partnership to create a 3D image of what John List might look like. And this was a really detailed composite because it was more than just a photo with some wrinkles. They were looking at like, who was this guy? What would he like to, you know, what would he want people to perceive of him physically when he enters the room? So they were able to discern he's probably wearing a suit. They were able to look at how stress affect other members of his family and how stress affects you in older age. So they were able to add some jowls, looking at his hairline, all like really details, down to the fact that he would want to be perceived as more important than he was, so he would likely have thicker rimmed glasses. And they put this out there. And then they put it on America's Most Wanted, and they get a tip in from a former neighbor of his in Denver that says, that guy looks a lot like my neighbor Bob Clark. And I get kind of chills saying that, because what a wild moment that must have been for that neighbor. And they were able to get more information. It all starts coming together where it's like, well, he is an accountant, he is a devout Lutheran. So John List hadn't changed anything about himself. He didn't assume a new personality. He was exactly the same. He just changed his name.
He didn't even change his hair color.
No, he really wasn't even trying to put on a disguise. I mean, they got really lucky with the thick rim glasses, but aside from that, it's like the same guy, you know? And they end up catching him, and on April 12th, 1990, he's convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, although he would die in 2008 at the age of 82 due to complications with pneumonia.
You know what's crazy to me about this? What I kept thinking as I'm going through this and reading this, the neighbor, this was her former neighbor, and so she was in another state at this point. He had moved. What if they were having a party and they turn on the TV and they turn on America's Most Wanted? What would have happened to the people in the room? What would have happened if he was sitting down with his wife watching this and she sees him? What would have happened? What would have happened if he saw this episode and was worried about people around him helping him get caught? Because as much as he wanted to start a new life, he also did not want to go to prison.
Yeah.
So I always wonder what would have happened. That's when I think about how much danger all these people were in. You know, what would he have done?
Because he was absolutely unrepentant and absolutely narcissistic, which is a trait that absolutely plays into the other case that we'll be talking about later, Christian Longo and familicide by father in general. There is this narcissism, which is like, I deserve better and I don't deserve punishment. Like, I am beyond reproach.
For the longest time, he kept saying this wasn't him.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the crazy thing is when law enforcement found him, he was working at a bank, and they said, "Are you Bob Clark?" I mean, you can look at him and you know that it's John List. And you're like, "Are you Bob Clark?" He says, "Yes, I'm Bob Clark." And he's like, "Are you John List?" And he says, "No." And it's like, I think you are. Like, I mean, it's
exact match, right?
He had to wait until the fingerprints were an exact match for him to actually admit his guilt. And so for me, I mean, he was sentenced to a number of life sentences, which I think was absolutely correct. And while you look at this and it's an older guy and you have compassion, you know, because you have compassion for the elderly, I hope. You're like, oh, well, he's old now. And, you know, no, he didn't feel even an inkling of sadness for what he did. I can't get over how cold-blooded this person was. And I think just all the premeditation that went into it, and that he never told a living soul after this, and he was just content to create, you know, a new life for himself, and that he would have never served time. You know, he never would have paid for what he did. He never would have found justice.
I cannot stop. Can you imagine, like, put yourself in that position? There were people working with him, married to him, living next door to him, having no idea they were in close proximity to a man who not only was a murderer, but a man who had killed the woman he married, the woman who gave birth to him, and 3 children he had raised. And they were talking to him every day, living next to him, sleeping in the bed with him, working with him. It's this, you would never, ever think that that was possible. You would feel like you would just know. You would feel like there would be something so overwhelmingly off about this person that you know. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
No one knew.
We had a guest on in season 1 and she said something, she referenced a statistic, I don't have it in front of me, but it was something along the lines of statistically, each of us have met a murderer in our life. And at some time in our lifetime, all of us have come encounter with a murderer. And you look at the John List case and you look at the people in his life and you think you guys had no idea how close to a murderer you were. And on that note, we're gonna leave you. That was the case of John List. But when we come back in part 3, we're gonna get into the details of the psychology behind familicide. We're gonna find a link between the 2 cases we've talked about. And we're also gonna introduce a new one. It's the case of Christian Longo. James Franco played him in a movie. Stick around for that.